What is going on, everyone? I am going to name every single opening in chess that has an animal name. Sit tight, it's going to be a good one. This is the crab for white, A4. Does not matter what black plays, and you finish up with H4, the crab. On to the next. The reversed rat is a variation of the Mises opening, where E5 is played after D3. On to the next. In the English, C4, knight F6, and B4 is the English orangutan. On to the next. You guys should all know this one. F4 is the bird. On to the next. If black follows up F4 with knight H6, that's the Horsefly Defense. On to the next. F4, F5, D4, D5 is the double duck formation. On to the next. Knight F3 and black giving up not only a pawn but a knight and recapturing with D7 is the Walrus. On to the next. Knight F3, D5, C4, and D4. Rook G1 makes the Penguin Variation. On to the next. The Hippopotamus Attack is an array of attacks where the only requirements are your minor pieces only go to the 7th and your pawns only go to the 6th. On to the next. In the English, if black responds to C4 with G6, that is the Great Snake Variation. On to the next. In the English, after C4, F5, knight C3, knight F6, E4, F take E4, and G4, that's the Porcupine Variation. On to the next. In the English, C4, knight F6, knight C3, and E6 is the Hedgehog System. On to the next. In the England Gambit, after D takes E5, queen to H4 marks the Mosquito Gambit. On to the next. D4, E6, C4, bishop, B4 check is the Kangero Defense. On to the next. D4, G6, H4, knight F6, and pushing H5 is the Lizard Defense. On to the next. In the Benoni Defense, there's D4, knight F6, knight F3, C5, D5, C4. Hawk Variation. On to the next. Old Benoni, D4, C5, D5, knight A6. Snail Variation. On to the next. Benoni again, D4, C5, D5, knight F6, knight C3, queen A5, the Woozle, like Winnie the Pooh's enemy. On to the next. D4, knight F6, F4, Canard. French for duck. On to the next. Trompowski, D4, knight F6, bishop G5, knight E4, H4, Raptor Variation. On to the next. In the Benoni, D4, knight F6, C4, C5, D5, knight E4, the Vulture Defense. On to the next. Indian Defense, D4, knight F6, C4, D6, G4, aged Gibon Gambit. On to the next. Zuckertord Opening, knight F3, knight C6, black Mustang Defense. One in the driveway. On to the next. In the Indian Defense, D4, knight F6, C4, B5, the Pyrenees Gambit. Dog. On to the next. We already had a great snake, but we got a regular snake. In the Benoni, D4, knight F6, C4, C5, D5, E6, knight C3, EXD5, CXD5, bishop D6, the snake. On to the next. In the Dutch, D4, F5, knight C3, D5, E4, Kingfisher, not Bobby. On to the next. F3, any move by black, king F2 is the Fried Fox Attack. On to the next. Suicide by Cliff, E4, knight A6, Lemming Defense. On to the next. Lion's jaw is not an animal. It's craniomandibular osteopathy. It's basically an enlarged bone in the jaw in dogs. In the Perk Defense, E4, D6, D4, knight F6, F3 is the lion's jaw. On to the next. How much pawns could a pawn pusher push if a pawn pusher could push pawns? E4, A6, D4, knight C6 is the Woodchuck Variation. On to the next. Very similar to the Woodchuck Variation, you got E4, A5, D4, knight C6, and that's the Snagglepuss Defense. On to the next. In the Owens Defense, E4, F6, D4, B6, C4, bishop B7 is the Unicorn Variation. On to the next. In the Alekhine Defense, there's E4, knight F6, E5 kick, knight D5, C4 kick, knight F4, the Squirrel. On to the next. E4, E5, knight F3, F5, D3, knight C6, and then EX F5, the Clam Gambit. On to the next. It doesn't take a scholar to see this is funny. E4, G6, queen F3, bishop G7, bishop C4, E6, D4, bishop capture D4. The monkey's bum. On to the next. Knight F3, C5, E3, G6, D4, bishop G7, D takes C, and queen A5 is the Rhamphorhynchus Variation. That's a dinosaur. On to the next. The Siroccopteryx is very close to the Rhamphorhynchus. Instead of capturing C5, we bring out our bishop to D3, and that pawn captures D4. We recapture the knight, and it's all the same. On to the next. E5, G6, D4, bishop G7, F4, C5, knight F3, queen A5 check is the Austriadactylus. On to the next. The modern pterodactyl is white taking the center while black fianchetto's kingside, knight C3 and C5. On to the next. In the pterodactyl defense, there's queen pteranodon, which is D4, G6, C4, bishop G7, knight C3, C5, D5, bishop takes C3 check, B takes C3, then queen A5. On to the next. E4, G6, D4, bishop G7, knight C3, C5, bishop E3, and Hangera. On to the next. E4, G6, D4, bishop G7, knight F3, C5, knight C3, queen A5, bishop E2, D6, Quetzalcoatlus. On to the next. E4, C5, knight F3, D6, D4, C takes D4, knight takes D4, G6, the accelerated dragon. On to the next. E4, C6, knight C3, D5, D3, D take E4, bishop G5, the Scorpion Horus Gambit. On to the next. In the Sicilian, E4, C5, knight C3, knight C6, knight GE2, Chameleon Variation. On to the next. E4, C5, knight F3, queen A5, Mongoose Variation. On to the next. E4, C5, knight F3, E6, D4, C take D4, knight take D4, knight F6, knight C3, knight C6, knight DB5, and then bishop C5. Cobra Variation. On to the next. E4, E6, D4, D5, knight D2, knight C6, C3, D take E4, knight take E4, E5, Thunder Bunny Variation. On to the next. E4, E6, D4, D5, knight C3, knight F6, bishop G5, bishop B4, knight E2, Wolf Gambit. On to the next. E4, E5, C4, the Whale. On to the next. E4, E5, bishop D3, the Tortoise Opening. On to the next. E4, E5, D4, E takes D4, F4, knight C6, knight F3, bishop C5, C3, Crocodile Variation. On to the next. E4, E5, F4, E takes F4, queen G4, Dodo Variation. On to the next. E4, E5, knight F3, D5, Elephant Gambit. On to the next. E4, E5, knight F3, D5, knight take E5, D take E4, bishop C4, queen G5, Wasp Variation. On to the next. E4, E5, knight F3, F5, G4, Lobster Gambit. On to the next. D4, D5, E4, D takes E4, knight C3, knight F6, F3, E takes F3, knight takes F3, G6, bishop C4, bishop G7, H4, Mad Dog Attack. On to the next. And that'll conclude every single variation that includes an animal name. I hope that you kind of enjoyed this unique video of mine, and I appreciate you guys. As always, thanks, and I'll see you on the next video.